welcome Manjushree Thapa to our campus. The South Asia Center, in collaboration with the Nepal Studies Initiative, is the lead sponsor for this event. And I'm going to hand things over to Asang Sherpa, who is co-director of the Nepal Studies Initiative, to introduce our speaker today.
I will need a mic, so I'll stand here. So first of all, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming on this very special Thursday evening. And it's a pleasure to see you all every time. I have to thank our generous sponsors. This event has been made possible with the generous support from several departments, not just the South Asia Center, Nepal Studies Initiative, but also the Simpson Center for the Humanities, the Department of English, Asian Language and Literature, and also would like to recognize the Elliott Bay Book Company for bringing out books here, bringing out Manjushree Thapa's book here today. So today we're going to do, after the talk, we'll have some time for Q&A, and it will be followed by some refreshments, some chai and samosas. So please don't leave right away. So before I introduce our esteemed guests, I would also like to say a few words about the Nepal Studies Initiative, especially for those who are new to our event. The Nepal Studies Initiative at the South Asia Center serves as the university's academic home for Nepal studies, and also a base for students, faculty, professionals, and community members in the Pacific Northwest, with scholarly ties to and interest in Nepal. So tonight's talk actually marks the end of this academic year's speaker series. It follows Dr. Amanda Snellinger's talk earlier this year, based on her newly published book, Making New Nepal, published through University of Washington Press and now available for purchase. So, in addition to our talk this week, we are also pleased to announce the successful completion of the symposium titled UW Nepal Partnerships in Health Innovation, Multidisciplinary Collaborations to Advance Population Health, which was held yesterday here on campus. We are honored to have our distinguished colleagues all the way from Kathmandu University join us on campus this week. If you're interested in Nepal Studies Initiative activities and would like to receive email updates, please see myself or David Citron, co-director of the program, and Scott, all the way there, to sign up for email updates. You can also learn about our program through our very active Facebook page at UW NSI. So we're extremely delighted to welcome Manjushree Thapa to deliver her talk, How Not to Narrate a Nation. It is also extra special to have her here at UW campus, back where she started, if I can say so. She received a Master of Fine Arts in English Fiction here, studying with Maya Sonnenberg, Sean Wong, David Shields, and Charles Johnson. We all know our guest, Manjushree Thapa, as the internationally recognized writer of fiction and nonfiction in English from Nepal. Her books have covered many important topics of Nepal. Her fiction, Seasons of Flight, for example, is about a Nepali woman who wins a U.S. green card in a lottery and moves to Los Angeles. The Lives We Have Lost is a collection of her reportages and editorials on Nepal's Maoist war and peace process. And Forget Kathmandu is her personal account of Nepal's history and current affairs. Her short stories have appeared in US-based and South Asian literary magazines, and her essays and editorials have appeared in the New York Times, London Review of Books, and Newsweek, to name a few. I would like to now turn to her latest fiction to share with you what I think is her impact not only on the literary field but also the general public. And the book, All of Us in Our Lives, published in 2016, has been reviewed by many, and there are many things to say about it, trying to situate the novel in the Nepali national landscape. Since reading this book, I've found myself thinking of the word ordinary as I think about this extraordinary book. Thinking deeply, I'm convinced that it is the women in this book that are ordinarily extraordinary. Ava Veridin, adopted from Nepal, returns to the country of her birth to do something important. Indira Sharma is a career woman, a wife, and a daughter-in-law who tries to balance it all while restraining her own desires. Sapna, who dreams of one day having the ability to develop her rural village, disappears. And Durga, harassed and victimized, is hidden, so those that matter can continue on with their lives as if nothing happened. These stories are ordinary because they are everywhere, and her book is extraordinary because they enliven them. This is the power of the novel I recognize in all of us in our lives, and the power of Manjushree. The readers are forced to look at the stories around us so we can understand them. Throughout her book, she has connected stories of one with stories of many, and in the process revealed stories of the nation. Legal citizens or not, she reminds us of the Nepali alive in us, in all of our lives. Without further delay, I would now like to invite Manjushree Thapa on stage for How Not to Narrate a Nation.
Thank you all. It's such a pleasure to be here. I want to just begin with a thank you to the Nepal Studies Initiative and everyone else who brought this program together, to Pasang and David Sidran and Scott Holiday. And I also want to start with an acknowledgement of being on Coast Salish land. For me, I was born in the original lands of the Newa people in Kathmandu Valley. It's a nation that gave us a lot of culture and history and philosophy, and is extremely special, and I feel really lucky to call that my hometown. And of course now I live in Toronto, which is the ancestral land of the Huron-Wendat and Mississaugas of the New Credit. So it's wonderful to feel connected to all the older histories. And talking of older histories, I was here 20 years ago in the University of Washington's Creative Writing program. I came here, I had been in Nepal for 7 or 8 years after college, which was also in the States, so I'd been back to Nepal and I'd worked in NGOs and in rural areas, and there'd been a lot of political unrest. So I came here with a very clear sense of what I wanted, which was, I had material, I had things to say, and I wanted to learn craft and figure out how to put those into stories. And it was really a kind of magical time. Maya and Sean are here. You can blame them for all of my writing. Everything I learned to write, I learned from them. So I wanted to start the talk with just talking about my experience in the creative writing program here. From very early on in the workshops, it occurred to me that the material I was trying to write about was very different from what my colleagues were writing. It seemed to me, and I talked about it a little bit in Maya's workshop today, there's this workshop situation, we read each other's stories and give each other feedback, and it seemed to me that a lot of my American peers were writing stories sort of about, we all write the same story. It's about love, it's about relationships, it's about, personal crises. And it was usually a relationship between one person and one other person. So it was a lover or a husband or a parent or a child or a friend. And it really struck me that it really was like they inhabited a little bit of a social vacuum. And the focus was very clearly on the individual and that individual's personal conflicts. So, it's again exactly the kinds of stories all of us all over the world are writing about, stories about individuals. But my American colleagues, and I really learned from this, and I would credit them and the workshops for this lesson that they imparted, which was about the very value of the individual and the importance of not typing or stereotyping, not writing characters as though they could be anyone else. It has to be the one individual. And that's the main lesson I took away from here when I went back to Nepal and started to write. But I also noticed that that wasn't quite true to my experience. So I had lived and went back to living in a very, very socially dense society where we were just, every individual was hemmed in by social relations, and they were constrained by it. There were, social strictures. If you were a woman, if you were in the Hindu caste structure, you were given your place in the hierarchy, and that's who you were. And so it's a society that really tries to define and place people very rigidly in a hierarchy. And that's, so the individual and the individuality of that character is really, needs to be carved out in this very rigid social structure. And my interest also in terms of writing was a little bit different, I thought, than my American colleagues. I thought that, in retrospect, it seemed to me after I started to write and decided what kinds of stories I wanted to write, that they were coming out of not just a liberal sphere, because I feel like what I learned about the value of the individual was the best kind of American education, which really focuses on liberal values and liberal education. But it seemed a little bit more towards the neoliberal side of things, where the individual is living in a very atomized society and has very little to do with the larger social structure around. Whereas I felt like I was coming out of a more Marxist perspective, or a post-Marxist perspective, where the individual was really shaped by society to a large extent and was given her place in society, and then needed to find the freedom, the individual freedom within that. So I felt like it was just very different kinds of political or philosophical backgrounds that we were coming from. And one comment that of one of my peers, Sonia Chung, who's gone on to write a couple of very beautiful novels, that she said to me in the writing workshop, really stayed with me afterwards. She said, "Have you noticed that your characters use the word Nepal a lot?" So, and the word Nepal crops up in your fiction a lot. And, I hadn't noticed that. I thought, but then it became very obvious that my American colleagues weren't writing stories where the characters sat around and discussed the state of things in America. They were in a more private space in their conflicts. So that comment really stayed with me, and I realized it was completely true. And it also made me realize that Nepalis do talk about Nepal a lot. It's you put a group of Nepalis together, and before too long they start talking about, what's the situation back home, or if they're back home, then what's the latest, and whatever's going on. And so, in a way, it seems to me that Nepalis are kind of obsessed with the nation state. And I think there are very good reasons for it. I think a lot of Nepalis who, like me, have lived through several democracy movements now will know this, but we've got, since the beginning of democracy in Nepal, that was 1950, we've had seven different constitutions. So from then, in my lifetime alone, we've had 5 of those. So when I was a child growing up in the absolute monarchy, that was one constitution that had been in place since 1960. After that, in 1979, when I was in school, there was a referendum about whether we wanted to change that. It didn't change. 1990 was the big democratic movement of my generation, so I feel like I was just out of college and it was hugely formative, and Nepal was going to change and finally become a democratic country very late in the day. In 1990, so there was an interim constitution then. In 1991, we came up with a proper sort of constitution with a constitutional monarch and a parliamentary democracy. And then by 5 years later, we're already having a Maoist insurgency that was asking for a republic and for the end of this sort of unified state, and the demand for federalism and decentralization started up then. That movement, which was when I was in graduate school here, and when I went back, went on to change. I mean, it changed Nepal very dramatically, with social relations changing a lot, not necessarily for the worse. A lot of the old feudal structures broke down. A lot of people lost their lives, 19,000 more. A lot of human rights violations. It was a very traumatizing experience to go through. And then, as that was going on, 2001, the royal family massacre took place, where allegedly the crown prince killed his entire family. And so that was kind of like the beginning of the implosion of the old Nepal, the Nepali state that we thought was going to work after 1990. So in 2005, the king violates the constitution, the new king and takes absolute power. 2006 again, there's a new democracy movement and an interim constitution. 2008, they formed the Constituent Assembly and got rid of the 250-year-old monarchy. And in 2012, the Constituent Assembly failed without making a new constitution. And finally, in 2015, after the earthquake, which destroyed so many people's lives, there was a fast-track constitution passed that did bring in a lot of the demands that the Maoists had made. So federalism is going on. It's just being instituted now with new provinces, and everyone's trying to figure out who has what power, which is very exciting. There are some things that were deeply disturbing about it, like a rollback on women's rights in relation to citizenship. But so all of this is in my lifetime, right? This is the place, the space, the collective space that we were all living through, in which we are also having our small, family crises, our relationships, our, all of the material of fiction. And so I think about it now, when I look at the US now, I don't know if this is the case, but the kind of whiplash that a lot of friends seem to be experiencing with maybe it's turmoil, or maybe it's just this sort of divide being exposed now and out in the open. That has been the sort of exhaustion of being Nepali, has been that you're living through constant turmoil. There's always, the state is constantly in flux, and you're living in a nation that's being unmade all the time and being made again and then being unmade again. And so I think this is why when I left here and started to write, it was completely natural for me to start writing about the nation state and to situate my characters very much in the nation state. I just want to read a little bit from Forget Kathmandu, which is a book I wrote I started it after the Royal Family Massacre, which was, I think, even more so than the Maoist movement, which was a very confusing thing to happen 5 years into democracy, to suddenly have a movement erupt and pretty much take down the state. It paralyzed the state within a very short amount of time, 10 years, it paralyzed the state. But the Royal Family Massacre, I think, was much more confusing because it was an implosion from within the old nation state. Keeping in mind that I grew up in a society that had censorship, that had, our school education curriculum, everything was propagandistic and not true to facts. There's a kind of person in Nepal likely, but not necessarily of college education, who carries the nation's history in the mind. Tapping into arcane knowledge of events that took place 50 or 100 years ago, he or she backs all pronouncements on current events with historical evidence, or the most solid evidence available, given how poorly our past has been recorded. Another kind of person passes the days in a lost-in-the-trenches daze about the present moment, piecing together shards of history and references and facts, none of which come together to offer the overall picture, the panoramic overview, the concise analysis, or the meaning of it all. This person is haunted by the realization that much knowledge is incomplete in Nepal, that the truth has been lost many times to speculation and can easily be lost again. I am the latter kind of person. After the massacre at the Royal Palace, garbled thoughts about the past jammed my mind, making me feel, I know all this, because something like this had happened before. Exactly what had happened before I couldn't recall, but I felt I did at some subconscious level know. Didn't some Shah king kill his own brother way back when? Or maybe it was the later Rana rulers who were always knocking off their family members. Hadn't some regent queen engineered a massacre? I can blame no one for my stupidity. It is, however, true that those of us who grew up in the 1970s received very partial history lessons. The panchayat system of indigenous or lack of democracy under an absolute king had implemented the nationalistic new education policy, which I studied under. Government-issued textbooks urged school children to feel a heated one nation under the Shah king pride. Because the present king's 11th predecessor had unified himself a nation, we were now in possession of our unique identities as Nepalis, For this we were beholden to the Shah dynasty. I was a dull child, but even a dull child can pick up on adult prevarication, and the rah-rah nationalism of our school books felt forced to me. It was too breathless, this celebration of the Shahs, too blown up and out of proportion. Nepal was, after all, one of the poorest countries in the world. And so the jingoism of the Panchayat era that we grew up with, we knew it was hollow, but we didn't know what was true. That was sort of the atmosphere that we found ourselves in when suddenly the entire state is imploding and we don't really have a history that we can rely on. Falsehoods result in a loss of faith. State-sanctioned falsehood results in a loss of faith in the state. As we grew up, it became obvious that we were not a peace-loving Hindu nation of poor but happy villagers smiling for the benefit of passing trekkers. The People's Movement, which restored democracy in 1990, allowed us to manifest ourselves as a real country with real politics. But because all through our past, our historians had been barred from writing true histories, even in 1990, we didn't know who we were. So we knew what was false, but we didn't know what was true. So I began to write nonfiction pretty much in response to this utter confusion about Nepal. I wrote Forget Kathmandu to explain the country to myself and to others. I think others found it helpful too. And then I went on to write a lot of reportage, particularly as the Maoist conflict sharpened and there were a lot of human rights violations, so I started to report on those and to go out of Kathmandu, which was sheltered from all of that, and to write about that. The Lives We Have Lost is a collection of those essays, and the very final one I wrote in 2012 when the Constituent Assembly failed without making a new constitution after the start of the peace process. So all the nonfiction that I began to write, I was also writing a lot of op-eds and commentaries about the political situation in Nepal. If you're a fiction writer, this is all, of course, to put it cynically, terrific material. It's absolutely the stuff of fiction, all kinds of conflict, from personal conflict to social conflict to political conflict is exactly what fiction writers feed on. And so I have to say, I wouldn't be honest if I didn't say that I felt really fortunate just to be in a situation where all of this was happening around me and everything was in the air. You could just sort of tap into it and write about it, and it would sort of speak to the moment. So in addition to my nonfiction, my fiction was also very much situated in politics and in the present moment, which brings me back a little bit to my later thoughts now on American fiction. When I was in graduate school, one of the things that had come up, I think it was then called Immigrant Fiction. I don't know if it still is called Immigrant Fiction, but it was sort of writers who were, writers like Junot Diaz or others who were writing from a specific cultural background, usually first-generation immigrants, not necessarily. And I feel like it's no accident that that kind of writing almost became some of the most revealing fiction literature about America during this period, because that kind of work also helped situate other writers like a Jane Smiley or a Marilyn Robinson or a David Foster Wallace, who would have passed just as generic American writers, also were placed by these other writers from other cultural backgrounds as coming from their own subculture too. So I think it helped everyone kind of recognize the diversity within the United States and within American literature too. I think my sense of American literature is that the one thing that it's arrived at very slowly is the literary tradition of engaged writing that the rest of the world has embraced with abandon from very early on. So I feel very lucky to have been part of the Nepali literary tradition, where writers are expected to pronounce on political events, expected to be parts of political movements, are expected to be engaged. That kind of writing, of course, takes place in South America, all over Europe, all over Asia. So for me, being in Nepal, reacquiring the Nepali language, reading all of the literature that other Nepali writers were writing in Nepali, and as far as I could find in other languages, translated into Nepali. It helped me really realize that that's the literary tradition that I came out of, and I was someone who aspired to be an engaged writer. So it's a very, it was for a while I was very comfortable in this way of defining myself. You know, it's a big tradition to be an engaged writer. But sometime after the publication of Forget Kathmandu, I began to see a little bit of danger in that kind of writing that I was doing. And specifically, I began to see the danger of the power that I had in a couple of ways. One is that I had power as an English writer, writing about a society whose entire intellectual life or cultural life took place in another language, a much less powerful language. So Nepali or any of Nepal's 123 different languages. So as someone who wrote in English, I began to see that I was also positioning myself a little bit as a gatekeeper to very powerful outsiders, whether they were in the donor world, the aid world, diplomats, Nepal hand, Nepal specialists. And it was very easy for me to slip into this role of the interpreter, sort of explaining fine points of Nepali history or culture to outsiders, and I was a little uncomfortable with that role. I also didn't like something else I noticed, and this was after the king took absolute power in 2005, and he imposed censorship on Nepal, so I had gone to Delhi because I wanted to be able to write freely about what was going on. And in very good faith, I felt that it was really important to speak on behalf of people who didn't have a voice and didn't have freedom of speech. So, you know, I wrote many, many op-eds at the time and, you know, was very, probably the most political I've been in what I was writing, and probably also the most simplistic and propagandistic, because basically I was saying we want democracy back, which was what I believe what a lot of people wanted. I don't think it was untrue, but I noticed that I was using the words we and us and our a lot, and you know, at some point it just began to needle me that I was doing that, and I wondered, you know, the concept of giving voice to the voiceless is very compelling, but what was I saying when I said us or we? So I stayed with that for a while. I thought about it and wondered, you know, who did I mean when I said we? Who did it include? Who did it exclude? And was I silencing anyone when I said we, given the power that I had? And I think, after thinking about it for a couple of years, I think the main reason it began to bother me was that the difference between the 1990 democracy movement and the 2006 democracy movement was that the entire civil rights movement in Nepal had blossomed in between then. And so what had been a country that's historically been ruled by about a population that amounts to about 15% of the population, which is high caste, so-called high caste Hindu men from the hills with access to Kathmandu. It's a very, very narrow group. So they've always been historically the ones who have governed in Nepal. And after 1990, you know, all of the movements for women's rights had started up. The movement for Dalit or untouchable Hindu castes rights had started up. Indigenous rights movements had started up. Language rights. The Manjushree people who live in the south had movements going on. The differently abled, the LGBT movement. All of these movements had come up in a very short period of time. And really they were the force that was behind the 2006 movement. The big demand was for federalism, for devolution of power from the center, for power sharing, for inclusion. That was the big demand of 2006. And so for me, I realized that the power that I had as an elite woman, anyone who speaks English, and if there are Nepalis in this room, anyone who speaks English is already elite, so there's that. But I had the social, because I had grown up in the States, I sort of had the social mobility of a man. I was quite unconventional in my lifestyle. I was from a sort of so-called upper caste with very strong ties into Kathmandu. And I had all of this reach because of my English writing. So it became very problematic for me to start saying we and us and all of that. Again, done in very good faith and for political purposes that I think are important. You know, I think democracy is a good thing to fight for. But I began to feel that I was talking over people who were already talking but less loudly. So it occurred to me that I needed to sort of be quiet, shut up, and listen instead, and to allow others with a sort of clearer, more complex lived experience of oppression in Nepal to start to narrate the nation. So it's a very awkward thing for a writer to advocate remaining silent. It's also, it sort of, you know, I like to write, I like to have opinions, I like to talk. But stepping aside and being quiet and listening to others and allow others to talk and share space and amplify the message of others, for me became really important. It became important to take my place alongside others or behind others who were already talking, instead of using my privilege to mask them or to cover them over. So particularly writers, I want to read a piece that I translated. You know, Nepal has, so all of the writers of Nepal are politically engaged, and they were speaking very loudly at that point, and they have since also been speaking very loudly. So there's a writer called Ahuti. And I want to read this because it's called The Story of My Poetry. It's an essay he wrote about how someone like him came to be a poet in Nepal. He was born to a Sarki family, which is the Hindu caste of cobblers, who are traditionally considered untouchable. And it's for him to have become, as he is now, an established poet in Nepal was a very unlikely journey. So I translated this essay in part. I'm going to finish it later. And I'll have to explain a couple of things in it, but it's the story of my poetry. There were two books related to the classics at home. One, the story of the Hindu epic, the Swasthani, the other, Krishna Charitra, or Stories of Krishna. The book on the Swasthani epic stayed in a dark, windowless prayer room for the gods Vir and Vayu, which I was scared to go into alone, even in the daytime. As for the book called Krishna Charitra, it was forever being tossed from side to side in the detritus of the shoe cobbling workshop. That book was thick, it didn't have a cover, its color was faded from having grown soiled. Some pages were folded and dog-eared, some pages were half-ripped, and the top right corner was puffed up like a ball. No one ever read that book, but grandfather would be upset if anyone should mistreat it and toss it around when moving around the cobbling tools. Don't throw books around like that, he'd say. And that's all he'd say. Even grandfather couldn't keep the book in a safe spot. So then he talks about how, he starts going to school. And my study of the poetry of the excellent Pandits began. Pandit being a reference to the Brahmin caste. Bhanubhakta Acharya, Leknath Paudil, Somnath Sigdil, Lakshmi Prasad Devkota. I loved to read poems, and since Nepali was my mother tongue, I always scored high marks on the tests. But those poems never spurred my mind to writing poems. Rather, the unfathomable greatness of those poems gave way to a certain demoralization about poetry in my mind. When I reached the age to dream and think about life goals, my first dream was to become the undying lover of some girl. Along with that, to become a doctor and also a writer. Third among these dreams was the dream to be a writer, but never till my youth did the dream of becoming a poet arise in me. Neither did I ever feel that I could write poetry. Why I dreamed at the time of being an undying lover or a writer is not necessary for this story, as it's unrelated to poetry. I'll surely write it somewhere else. But once I started writing poems, I understood why the desire to write poetry had never before arisen in me. To be honest, the reason was the forced use of Sanskrit verse in Nepali poetry, which tended to be very formal. My grandfather was the only Sarki man of his generation in all of the 36 Sarki houses of my village who could read and write and do mathematics. Some casteless, wayward ascetic had taught him, but grandfather didn't know Sanskrit. Neither my lineage nor my entire community had any relation with the Sanskrit language or with Sanskrit verse. There were folk songs and fables in each one of our veins, but the textbooks contained no folk songs. Being considered untouchable by Sanskrit verse kept me from falling in love with poetry. in my youth. When I create a poem that truly satisfies me, I think of that rebel poet who was born in the Brahmin caste, Gopal Prasad Vimal. Had he not been there, or had the age of free verse not begun in Nepali poetry, I wouldn't exist. Perhaps Chamal would be there, but Bimal Niba or Shravan Mukherjee, impossible. As far as I know, today's Binod Bikram Casey or Sangit Strota wouldn't exist, and neither would he. Names a whole lot of writers who would never have had access to that sort of high Sanskrit kind of writing that was in vogue then. Writing and writing rules have no social class, but certain classes can use them for special interests of their own. In this sense, Sanskrit verse was used in Nepali poetry as a representative of Hindu feudalism. When I hear someone claiming that the only proper poems are those written in verse, I feel as if some corpse has risen up from the grave to plead a case, to view verse as necessary in poetry, and to consider free verse poems inferior, is to claim that Nepal's indigenous, Dalit, Kshetri, Sannyasi, or non-Brahmin people have no right to claim poetry making. So that's the kind of writer who is already speaking. And so for me, it really became an issue of shutting up and listening to other writers or sharing the space with other writers or amplifying their voices. So how not to narrate a nation, or how to, don't speak over those who are talking, don't drown out their voices. Don't pretend that these things aren't being said by other better situated people, look for them, right? And if you're writing in English, in a society that doesn't live in English, then don't act as though the discourse in the other local languages doesn't exist. Learn it, engage with it, acknowledge it, credit it, amplify it. There's an archaeologist, Joan Hammond, I don't know if anyone knows her, she's based in Kamloops, not too far away, and one of the things she talks about is indigenous anthropology and archaeology, about whether you're researching about the Indian subject or you're researching with them. And that to me seems very much the distinction in my mind too. So in my own writing, I came up with 3 solutions related to the 3 kinds of writing I do. One was nonfiction. I just stopped writing commentaries and just stopped writing op-eds and all of that. I still write nonfiction, I still write reportage. Because reportage to me pertains, it sort of conveys the news of the world, and it's in its complexity. It doesn't try and simplify it into anything. Commentating is a sort of narrower art than that, and it has its uses for political ends, but I don't feel like I'm the person who needs to commentate on Nepal anymore, which was a slightly difficult decision to arrive at. The easier decision to arrive at was to translate, and to translate more than I had done before. This issue, Lalit, is, I edited it, it's got a lot of work from Newari and Nepal Bhasa and Maithili and Nepali languages translated into English by a variety of English writers. And I just finished translating Indrabad Rai's novel from Darjeeling, Ajaramin Dasra, and so I feel like translating the work of other Nepali writers is my way of paying homage to them, amplifying their voices, and sharing that space that I have with them. The hardest thing for me to figure out in terms of how to narrate and how not to narrate Nepal anymore is to do with fiction. So I feel like there's this Buddhist concept of ultimate truth and relative truth. Ultimately, I don't believe that we should all be stuck talking about our own experiences, and particularly in fiction, I feel like we are capable of empathy, we're capable of understanding each other and talking about each other's experience, and that is almost the entire point of fiction. So I've had, over the years, I've had friends say, why don't you write a story of a Madheshi woman, a deeply oppressed Madheshi woman, or an indigenous woman in Nepal? And I've stayed away from that because ultimately I feel like I could do that, but on the level of the relative truth, which is the level that we live in, I feel like maybe I'm not the right person to write that story. Maybe there's an indigenous writer who will write that story soon. And I happen to know there are. Or maybe there's other writers with truer lived experience who will write that story. So that's for me a little bit of an ongoing dilemma in terms of how to write Nepal in a way that doesn't silence or speak for other people. And it's something I'm still struggling with. I'm going to just end with a little reading from all of us in our own lives, which is, it came out a couple of years ago in South Asia. It's coming out in Canada in September, which is interesting. And it's set in the international aid world in Nepal, which is a very powerful industry in Nepal. It's set specifically in the very lucrative industry of women's empowerment. And it's got several interlocking characters, as Pasang was saying before. There's Ava Berman, who's the most powerful woman in the book. She's gone to Nepal. She was adopted from there. She's gone back there to try and forge some kind of relationship with the place, but she's also in a position where she can hand out a lot of aid to large non-government organizations. Indira is a leading gender and development expert, and her career depends very much on being able to get some of this aid. The least powerful person is Sapana, who's a sort of beneficiary in the village, where there's this chain of subcontracting that happens in international aid, where one organization gives money to another, it eventually trickles down to the village level, where you have community-based organizations that hold workshops or do some very important things. And so it's set in a very cynical industry. I think of it as a cynical industry, but it's not entirely a cynical novel. And there's the final character is also Gyanu, Sapana's brother, who works in the Middle East, and he's sort of a foil to the women characters in the novel, and is there to suggest at the empowerment or disempowerment of Nepali men also. I'm going to read from it and then just end on a couple of thoughts. So this section that I'm reading for is where Ava is going for the first time to the orphanage that she was adopted from, and she's been avoiding doing so from the moment she got there. She was halfway down the hill by the time Hariha, the gatekeeper, scrambled to the gate. Picking her way past a pile of garbage by the neighbor's house, Ava walked to the main road, where a cab sidled up to her. "Taxi, taxi, taxi?" The driver looked 10 years old. "No," she said. The driver grew baleful. "Taxi, sister! Sister, sister! Taxi!" Okay, Ava got in. "Can you take me to Balmandir?" She hesitated over the name. Then, as she'd seen her friend Thomas do, she tried to bargain. "How much?" "And 400 rupees, sister." Unlike Thomas, she couldn't haggle over what amounted in the end to $4. "Okay," she said. "Okay," the driver cried as they started off. "And you which country from, sister?" "Canada." "And sister, Canada is too far." He launched into a spirited if garbled conversation, and she answered his questions politely. "Yes, it's far. Yes, it's nice. I like Nepal too. It's also nice." Till he stalled for a lack of a vocabulary. Then the driver turned on the radio and sang along to a Nepali pop song, careening through the pocked, bumpy streets, swerving to avoid pedestrians and motorbikes. A sharp stench arose as they crossed a bridge. Ava looked about in alarm at the befouled Bagmati River, which trickled like an open sore, rank and infected. How could people live like this? They shot past a stretch of government buildings, the National Archives, the Supreme Court, Parliament House. The center of town had wide streets and large glass-front store shops. She saw a crowd forming around a man, a performer of some kind. At the intersection, a woman traffic police waved them on, her face hidden behind a dust mask. Two middle-aged women at a bus stop were poring over a newspaper. A motorcyclist whizzed past the cab, loaded down with a family of 4. This, Ava thought, was what she had barricaded herself against, that Christmas when she had come with Mom and Dad and Luke. All this, she hadn't wanted any of this to bear a relation to her. Back in a less central part of town, the driver announced, "Balmandir." Ava tensed up reflexively as he drove through an open metal gate. She was thirsty from last night's excesses. She should have brought a bottle of water. The driver halted in front of a rambling old palace. "And, waiting here, sister?" "No," Ava said, then changed her mind. "Actually, yes, could you wait?" Petrol too big price today, and 900 rupees, sister. Okay, just wait for me here, it won't be long, she said. The orphanage wasn't quite the crumbling wreck she'd remembered it as. It was palatial if run down, and it was ornate, decorated with columns, arches, and balustrades. There were 2 entrances, each flanked by Greek-style fluted columns with Corinthian capitals. The paint on the facade was chipping, as it was on the doors and windows, but there was a faded grandeur to the building. There was no one in the front lawn. Ava remembered the children who'd been there that Christmas, how they'd stared at her. That old wound prickled inside. From behind her, a woman said, "Existential Earth?" Ava spun around and saw a young woman with brochures of some kind. "Oh, I thought, isn't this Balmandir?" she asked. The woman pointed at one of the entrances. "That is orphanage side. This," she pointed at the other entrance, "is Academy of Arts side." She handed Ava a brochure. "Please, you are welcome to see. Exhibition is on the theme Existential Earth." "Oh, thank you," Ava said. With a smile, the woman disappeared into the Academy of Art. Ava turned back to the orphanage. The building was still. There was no movement in any of the windows. Where were the children? The story, eventually all 4 of the characters end up sort of bumping up against each other and changing their lives. So I just wanted to end on the thought of, with the ambivalence that I have about how do you narrate a nation in fiction, when fiction is ultimately about individuals. So going back to what I took back from the University of Washington's creative writing program and the value of the individual, for me the importance in this novel and in all of the fiction that I've written has really been to come up with characters who cannot be mistaken for anyone else, so that no one can really read this novel and look at Ava's story and generalize from that into anything else. It is very much about the characters who are in this novel, which I think is very important, and yet I felt like I needed to have space for society in the characters themselves and the way they inhabit their own lives. So I ended up trying to sort of have everyone's empowerment, and the novel is very much about the women's empowerment industry, but everyone's power and disempowerment sort of complicated, so that even though Ava was this very powerful woman in the novel, she has a personal wound about having been abandoned or unwanted as a baby. Sapana, who is the most disempowered woman, is also of a very well-placed family in the village, and she has other friends who end up having to go to India just to make a living. And Ganu, who is her brother, ends up leaving the country entirely, and he has that mobility because he's a man, and it's easier for men to do that. And Indira Sharma, who's the big aid industry officiary, she ends up kind of running a little corruption racket. But she also ends up empowering a lot of women in the process. So that was my solution for that novel, and I'll see what my solution is for novels going forward. Thank you so much for coming, listening, and I'm very happy to take any questions or comments or suggestions. If anyone has any idea how to help narrate a nation, that would be helpful. Thanks.
Thank you, that was really fascinating. You spoke about wanting to step back and do amplification and listening, and one of the things you're actively doing is translating as well. But can you speak more about translation and how that is a part of the process? Both when thinking about but translating to open it, this talent and this intellect, and make it accessible to people who may not have, be able to read it or absorb it otherwise. But then also the actual act of translating, and of thinking, of course, like Walter Benjamin and what he says about translation and the sort of decisions you make along the way of doing the translating.
Thanks for that tiny question. So, so when I began to translate, it was I was less confident of what I wanted to translate, and I tended to stick to works that seemed to speak of the moment or came out of the literary tradition in Nepal. And now, as I get older and older and older, I feel like the writers I want to translate are the ones who don't get much space in the literary canon of Nepal, which is extremely exclusionary. So women who are much more visible now, but were almost non-existent. There were 2 or 3 or 4 women writers when I was a young writer in that milieu. Writers from the non-Brahmin and Kshatriya, sort of not higher castes, Hindu castes. Writers from, there are very severe language barriers for me to translate indigenous writers if they're writing in languages other than Nepali, so I'm limited to Nepali. But I have worked in the past from their work translated into Nepali, and I can translate that into English. So in terms of who I'm interested in translating, I feel like, since it is such an act of intervention, it is such an amplification of voices, and it does actually, it's kind of like an homage to the literary world, but it is also, it does change, it really helps writers to have their work translated into English. And I've been really pleased when, then they get invited to seminars abroad, or, and their work finds a larger audience outside of Nepal, because that is what the goal of translation is to get it out as far as you possibly can. So, there's that. The problem, as I found out when I was editing this, I realized that in order to really come up with a body of work that reflects Nepali literature as a whole, we almost need to redo the canon in Nepal and come up with a whole new canon that isn't exclusively based on the sort of high caste literary traditions, which are so exclusionary, as Abudin was mentioning. So the Nepali literary world itself has to redefine itself and include all of the other languages. I mean, not all 123 languages have scripts or have published modern literature. A lot of them would have the traditional oral literatures, but not necessarily modern writing. But what there is needs to be redefined and redrawn. So I feel like that's such a big project that I can't really see, unless activists who are there, and there are a lot of language rights movements also going on, so unless they take it up, or it's a big collaborative effort, I'm not seeing that. So for me, the politics of translation has been very piecemeal with certain pieces, just to try and balance out the imbalances, which are pretty great right now. So that's the politics of it. The actual nitty-gritties of translation are a lot of fun, but maybe not, maybe too big to get into about the movement from one language to another, all the syntax, grammar, vocabulary, all that. It's a lot of fun.
I was taken with your statement as fiction is essentially about individuals. These individuals live in a population.
Yeah.
What if the population was the entity you wanted to describe? I mean, you're talking about groups within Nepal, and these individuals are representative of those groups. Why not take a population perspective? Why can't we write about fictional populations?
I think there is literature that would take an entire town or a community or an era as its main subject, but the vehicle for that story would still be through individuals. I don't know of any literature that doesn't have characters who are individuals, who, so the story of an entire town without the story of the individuals who live there. I don't know of any of that. So I think the individual is a conduit for the town's or for the society's story. It's a question of whether the author is taking the society as a subject too or not. And some writers will take it on more and some won't. But I don't know that you could do away with the individual. It's an intriguing thought. I'm sure some experimental writer somewhere could do it. Is that what you were trying to ask?
Yeah, I mean, if you think of the Gaia hypothesis, or, the Earth as an organism, or subsections of that as the organism, or, so in this country, people are focused on individuals and they lose sight of the population.
Yeah.
And how to tell that story without having people focus on individuals, I think, is the challenge.
You know who wrote what I thought was a brave attempt, but it was a horrendous novel, is E.O. Wilson.
No.
Had a novel with ants as the main character. And I couldn't read it, but it got a lot of attention. I struggled, I just couldn't relate to the ants. But it was very much about ant society, and he was an insectologist, he studied ants all his life. So obviously he was writing about something very important. But it may be possible, and possibly someone will do it.
I did have a question. I really liked this discussion about engaged writers, and I was just curious about, I guess I was thinking about this when you were explaining it in terms of maybe an ecosystem, like what makes writers engaged in different places, and the role of, I guess, the audience or the perceived audience, and how writers or artists in general become and maintain their social engagement. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on the role of audience and engaged artists, and I guess between U.S., Canada, and Nepal, that difference.
I think there's such a thing. So, in the States, there's also regional writing, which I think is quite a lively movement right now. There is engaged writing in Canada. I spent a year after I moved there reading Indigenous literature, and to me it was no surprise that the communities that experience the most friction and political friction and suffering, their suffering is the sharpest, also come out with the stories that are the most revealing about a society. So that was very educative for me, that there is engaged writing going on, but it's not what's celebrated. It's not in the mainstream. The mainstream would still be. I love Alice Munro's story, but that would be the ideal that people are told to aim. Young writers are given. So I think a lot of regional writers do find regional audiences to communicate with, and that does strengthen their work. In societies like Nepal, in Europe, you have, it's expected that a fiction writer would have a very clear politics that they're working out of, and during political events, they would speak out about that if they can, if they're in a situation where they can. So it's such a clear expectation, and not all writers take it up, but I think writers are not punished for doing that. Whereas I remember in the States, I think it was during the George Bush years, I may be wrong about that, maybe it was afterwards, but Clinton or earlier, Jane Smiley began to write an op-ed piece every now and then. I don't know if anyone remembers this, but she's not someone who writes in a tradition of, no one would have expected her to have her politics on her sleeve. And it was interesting, but it wasn't particularly, that's not why I read Jane Smiley. I learned she was a Democrat, and good, that was fine. So it's not a tradition that's rewarded here. I think that's changed. I think there are writers. Junot Diaz, I would say, is an engaged writer. And Chimamanda Adichie is an engaged writer. So I think there is that space, and there are some writers who are given that space, they're able to exist, they're rewarded for it, they're asked to give their opinion on, public events. But I think it's a hard-won space here, it's not expected. I mean, I certainly remember when I was in the writing program that it was kind of just assumed that if you were doing political writing, then you lacked art. So somehow art was on one side and politics was on the other side, and if you did too much politics in your writing, that meant you didn't have art. And I don't think that's assumed around the world. I mean, a lot of South American writers are very artful and also very political. It's a different expectation. I didn't answer that.
Thank you.
So I'm thinking of the role and status of women in Nepal, and back when you were a child, you didn't take a standard trajectory for a Nepali woman for a lot of different reasons, but I'm just curious about your sense of right now in Nepal compared to 40 years ago. To what extent do women have choices in the trajectory of their lives? To what extent is it still, you must marry, you must have children, you must, meet all these social obligations?
I think, the Maoist movement was very revealing for all of us, also because it had been those feelings of rebellion had been so suppressed. That, those of us who came up through the sort of softer bourgeois space and, got an education, got some mobility, got some freedoms, fought for a little bit more and were able to change the trajectory of our lives. That's sort of the gradual space that came up, but, the Maoist, when it erupted and there were, Maoist, the women in the army, the women who broke from their families and left and joined this revolution, I think that was very eye-opening for all of us. And the question was always, will they be able to return to society, and how will society rehabilitate these women back into the norm? Well, I don't think you do. I think the norm is gone. There is, I think now, part of the civil rights movement has also been to try and resist the dominant Hindu cultural norm. And that's certainly been the case for women. The Maoists did a lot of these when there's this obsession about women's purity, and so when they're menstruating, they're impure, and the Maoists did a lot of temple entry movements during that time. Also around the Dalit rights movement, the taboos around untouchability are breaking down. So I think there's a lot of space now, but I think the price that individual women have to pay can be very high if they're not supported by a community around them. So I think for the individual woman, if they do not break out of the family, which is the first site of oppression, and out of their larger family milieu, which can be quite extensive and constraining, then it becomes very hard. But I think now we have a lot of... So when I began my career there after college, I was almost always the only woman at anything. And that's just no longer the case. It's really changed, and women's groups, grassroots women's groups, all the way to the top has changed. So the things that are holding a lot of Nepali women back are, Gayatri Spivak talks about this, how love can be very treacherous. I think a lot of relationships, expectations around family can be very, very constraining. But if you can get your head around that, there's a lot more mobility and space now.
I'm curious about your experience of translating Indrabal Roy's book, because he's a very unique writer. He's not based in Nepal, and he implemented new styles in writing. And how does your experience of narrating or not narrating a nation, or not defining an individual, or how that work in that particular book, Acharamita? So how did that?
For those who don't know Indrabal Roy, he narrated Darjeeling. He was the writer of Darjeeling. This novel is set in 1958, post-independence India. Darjeeling that's just coming to form itself and figure out its politics, and is just the beginnings of two movements that went on to shape it. One is the Maoist movement there, the Naxalite movement, and the other is the rise of Nepali, the Gorkhaland movement, the Nepali Pride movement. Those things are what the novel points to. And he is a very inventive writer, so it's like translating James Joyce. There's a lot of play in his Nepali, his use of Nepali, and it's shot through with Bengali, it's shot through with Hindi. There's a lot of sort of invention in his language, so, which is why I waited. I actually got his permission about 10 years ago, and I was so intimidated that I thought it would take me 4 years to do. I just thought it would be so difficult to do. But I found an editor from Darjeeling, and basically was reassured that he would be able to really help me with this. So it was a very collaborative process, and I think a lot of translation ends up being quite, or the best translations end up being quite collaborative, because I had Kathmandu Nepali, my editor Anurag had Darjeeling Nepali, and we consulted a wide number of other people. I ended up going to Darjeeling to meet the author, and there were about 5 or 6 real points of confusion at the very last draft that he was able to clarify for me. So it was particularly collaborative as a process, but also I felt that it was interesting for me because it's a book that was written in Nepali but not from Nepal. And within India, the Nepali community is extremely disempowered, and they've launched this heroic struggle to get Nepali recognized as one of India's 23 national languages. They've set up a literary world out of nothing, basically out of people who were brought over to build the railroads. They've created this heroic literary landscape. And so for me it was very interesting to be able to amplify his voice in India. Now he has been recognized, he's won the Sahitya Academy Award, which is the highest literary award in India, but nobody has read his work because it hasn't been translated before. So it was really fun for me to be able to kind of show India what that little Nepali corner of India, how sophisticated it is literarily and how rich it is. So it was so much fun. I loved it. But it was, the language was very difficult. But it only took me 1 year. It didn't take me 4 years. So I should have done it earlier.
First of all, thank you very much. You kept me engaged for an entire hour without any slides or other aids. It's a wonderful talk. I'm not a student in this area, but the things that you describe as of interest to you in thematic ways, women's rights, poverty, political power, what about religion? It seems to me that not only in Nepal or in South Asia, but in this country as well, and throughout history and throughout the world, so many of our inequities and wars and harmful customs are grounded in religion. And religion is very grounded in various countries. In your work or in the work of other people that you know, does anybody examine that, call that into question?
Yeah. I would say the Nepali literary milieu is decidedly secular, and
Not just secular, but
but
what about
Hindu is-
anti-religion?
well, Hinduism is so Ahuti's work in the Hindu hierarchy, he is considered untouchable. So for someone like him to fight against that and to get himself a space in this high literary milieu is a very real struggle. So it's a lot of people engaged with Hinduism in particular, I would say, because that's the dominant religion, and it is one of the most, I'll say it, it's one of the more bigoted social structures that there can be, because everyone is given a place. So someone is high, someone is low, women are like this, men are like that, everyone is defined, and there's a rigidity to it. And so it's been something that a lot of writers have written against, sort of fought against, the secular space, the anti-religious sentiments. They're very strong, they're very dominant. I would say there are a few writers who write with sort of cultural overlay of religion. So you'll have some writers who use Hindu imagery or religious imagery in their work in a non-critical way, but the vast majority are extremely critical. For myself, I was a militant atheist from the age of 14 onwards, when I realized that as a woman I was considered impure, and pretty much have remained so all the way. I'm very interested in Buddhist philosophy, but as religions go, I'm quite decidedly non-religious. But all of us in our own lives, one of the ideas I wanted to play with was the Buddhist concept of interconnectedness, so that even the most powerful and the most disempowered characters sort of end up being interconnected in their lives. So I'm interested in the ideas, and but in a very decidedly secular way. But to answer your question, a lot of writers fight against religion in Nepal. And there's a lot to fight against. It's a tough one. If that's all, I think we should have some Muslim.